Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening. We welcome all of you to this webinar hosted by the Unit of Applied Neurobiology and the University of Edinburgh. We are deeply grateful with the speakers and participants. We are really honored to have an audience from 5 continents. My name is Soledad Segretin, and together with Sebastián Lipina and Nicolas Chevalier, we organized this meeting with the aim to address the conceptual and methodological advances in the study of development of self-regulation, cognitive control, and executive functions, as well as their implications in different scenarios. To approach this objective, 5 experts in this field who are proposing new ways of considering this phenomena will present their considerations based on the 3 main questions we have included in the program. And then after the presentations, we devote time for questions. Those sent by participants, I have to say more than 300 questions, were shared with the speakers. And you will also be able to send your questions through the chat during the meeting. We apologize in advance for not including some of the topics you have asked about. We hope you can understand this. And well, now we are going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nancy Garon. Well, Dr. Garon is currently an associate professor at Mount Allison University in Canada. Her research focuses on the early development of executive functions and temperament as it relates to social adjustment. She has done research on children with autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And currently she is working on a battery of hot executive function tasks for preschoolers. Well, Nancy, I will. Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm having trouble managing the, oh, there we go. Okay, so hello everybody. I'm really pleased to be invited on this web seminar on a topic that, one of actually my favorite topic, self-regulation. And I'm glad to hear, to be able to share my thoughts on it. Oh, for some, okay. Some reason my thing is not, it was working. Why is this not?
If you click on it, maybe it will.
Yeah, I clicked on it. It's not. This is funny. Yeah, it's not moving. Oh, there
it goes.
So our organizers have asked us to answer 3 big questions as far as I'm concerned. So let's move on to the first big question. And I apologize ahead of time. I may have overly simplified things, but you know, if the topics are a lot more complicated than, you know, some of my simple explanations have that I have given. So first up, how do you define self-regulation, cognitive control, executive function, and their associations? So my concept of self-regulation keeps evolving and changing, but like most researchers, I think of self-regulation as a general term referring to the modulation of behavior, cognition, and emotion in order to achieve a goal. One of the things that I think is an important distinction in self-regulation is whether that self-regulation involves conflict or no conflict or little conflict. So I'll give you an example. This is my granddaughter, Aubrey. And Aubrey has a goal in mind, and the goal is to chase our cat Nix. And in going towards this goal, she's modulating some of her motor processes, but there is no conflict in this in this self-regulation. However, in this situation, she does face conflict because this is our cat. This is our cat Darwin, and Aubrey is passionate about our cat Darwin. She just loves him so much. And so Aubrey has to choose between, should she enjoy patting Darwin now, or should she get a big thrill out of rubbing her whole face on his nice furry body and having him run away? So these are kinds of conflicts that we face every day. The ones involving are the kinds of self-regulation conflicts we face every day. So I'll be talking mostly about self-regulation that involves conflict in this presentation. The first one I want to talk about is self-control. And self-control involves a conflict between two goals. And you can think of goals as a desired end state. And this is basically a representation that has a lot of emotion attached to it, motivation and emotion attached to it. And so it's very similar to what Zilazzo has called hot executive function. Even though, I mean, there's so many definitions in the literature, but that's one of them. So I'll give you an example of something that maybe some of you may know about because of the COVID situation. I know I've gained weight during the COVID situation. So let's say you see a big piece of yummy chocolate cake, and one of your goals is to eat this nice yummy cake. But this may go in conflict with your second goal of being at a healthy weight. So this is a common conflict that we face on a day-to-day, and it's a lot harder than some of the other types of self-regulation. In the developmental literature, one of the most famous tasks that we have that measures self-control is the marshmallow task. And in this task, the child is placed in a room with a marshmallow and told that if they want to wait till the examiner comes back, they can have 2 marshmallows, or if they want to eat the marshmallow right away, they can ring the bell. And as some of you may have seen in some of the really funny YouTube clips, it's really hard for little kids to not eat the marshmallow right away. So another form of self-regulation that involves conflict is cognitive control. And the conflict usually here is between cognitive processes or motor responses. And a lot of what I think of as falling under the rubric of cool executive function are the same as this cognitive control. So I'll give you an example of this. The Stroop task is probably one of the better known example of this type of self-regulation. Here the participants are asked to name the ink color. Now it's not a problem if they're just day-to-day words. However, the problem comes is if the words are color words that conflict with the ink color. So in the child development literature, a similar task is the day-night task. Here the child is asked to say night when they see a sun and day when they see the moon. So they again have a conflict here between a prepotent response of saying day when they see the sun versus a more effortful response of saying saying night when they see the sun. See, I'm even having trouble with my executive function. So moving on to the second big question is, and I have a lot under this, but I had to simplify. What are the implications and challenges would the current approaches imply for scientific research in the field? So one of the things that I find is when I go to the literature on self-regulation is that it's overwhelming. So there are various disciplines in psychology and in other areas that are doing research on self-regulation, and they all have their different traditions and their different terms. As well, we've ended up with many models of self-regulation. So we need a little bit of integration. We need to find some commonalities among the models. We also need to become clearer about what our definitions are so that we're not using the same terms to refer to different things. Another challenge that we face is measurement issues. So one of the ones that I've been kind of watching in the literature is executive function one construct or more in preschool? So a lot of people have gone back and forth, and some people think, have argued that especially the cool types of executive function, that they differentiate more as they get older, that there might be one or maybe two constructs or types of cool executive function when you're in preschool, but that it gets more and more as you get older. Another issue is the hot versus cool executive function. I think that this issue is really interesting because I think in part the problem is some people say that it's there's just one overall executive function. Some people say there's a distinction between hot and cool. But I think maybe part of the problem is in how we're defining hot executive function. And I think we need to really get some more clarity on that. And one of the other challenges that I've been noting is how do we measure the same thing at different ages? And that's a developmental challenge that I think is really important when we're measuring the self-regulation of children with developmental disorders in particular. So some of the challenges that I think we're progressing towards is how we improve self-regulation. So some of the literature indicates that self-regulation, especially the types involving executive function, are plastic, that they're amenable to training. A recent literature review by Diamond and Ling, really nice review by them, indicated that, you know, some of the approaches are promising, but not all of them are equal. One issue that they commented on was whether one type of training, let's say for working memory, generalizes to other types of self-regulation, let's say response inhibition. A second issue that they noted was whether the improvements could be maintained over a long term. And then finally, they also noted that other factors, for example, like stress, really impacted how people were able to self-regulate. So one of the challenges that I think we're starting to make progress towards is what are the early building blocks of self-regulation? So one model that I really like is that by Jiva and Feldman 2008. And basically they have a hierarchical model of self-regulation where they see early physiological regulation as foundational for later self-regulation. And they talk about how self-regulation depends on caregivers and others in the child's environment early on, and that eventually with this help, the child becomes more autonomous later on. So this brings the question as to how dependent is self-regulation on lower level processes? Some of the clues, so we can get some clues from when things go wrong in self-regulation. So for example, babies who are born premature often have physiological dysregulation. And one study by Feldman et al. 2013 found that by implementing some programs that help babies with physiological self-regulation, that they could improve measures of self-regulation like executive function 10 years later. Other clues come from orphanages. So for example, Nelson and his group have done lots of work on Romanian orphanages where babies don't have a lot of one-on-one contact with caregivers. And what they found is that later on, these babies have are lower on a variety of measures of self-regulation. But if they are adopted before the age of 2, that this improves their self-regulation later on. And then finally, research on children who've been abused and neglected indicates that there are alterations in the brain networks underlying self-regulation. So one area that I'm particularly interested in is early social cognition in autism spectrum disorder. So we know that children with ASD show reduced responsiveness in face-to-face interaction with their parents. And that what's interesting is that in typical children, this dyadic interaction is linked to emotional regulation and later self-regulation. What's more, these children also show reduced joint attention. For those of you who don't know what joint attention is, it's when a parent and a child, or really any two people, pay attention to something jointly that's in the environment. And while this may seem like a simple process, it's actually really, really important. It's basically a gateway to accelerated learning of cultural norms and all kinds of learning. And we know that joint attention is linked with later communication skills and later self-regulation. So basically, there's lots of things along the way that can interfere with the typical trajectory, as I'm illustrating this by the solid blue line of self-regulation. So you could, it may be that you have a child who's born premature, who has some physiological dysregulation, and this puts them on an altered trajectory. You may have a child who's born with a developmental disorder that affects face-to-face interaction, dyadic interaction with their parents. Excuse me. You may have a child who's being neglected or abused, who's experiencing altered face-to-face interaction with their parents. But while there are pitfalls along the way, there's also a lot of opportunities. But because we know that because of the long trajectory that self-regulation takes, that there's a lot of places along the way that we can intervene. So with training and early intervention, it may be that we can put children back on, you know, a typical trajectory for self-regulation. So how should these approaches be considered with dialogues, in the dialogues with policymakers? Our third big question. So we know that self-regulation is really important for a variety of later outcomes. This is a consistent finding. So for academic, peer interaction, physical and mental health, we also know that self-regulation deficits are implicated in a variety of different mental disorders, including developmental disorders. So for example, like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, conduct disorder. So we know, so we can tell policy makers that it's really important and to try to improve self-regulation and try to intervene. So what can we do? So there are many things that we could do. We have a wealth of scientific knowledge now on self-regulation. So one of the things we could do is translate this knowledge and provide it to key stakeholders like parents, teachers, pediatrician, nurses, on different variables that impact self-regulation. The other thing we can do, and we are doing in various countries, is early assessment of different factors that are involved, that are precursors to self-regulation. And finally, we also have to invest in early intervention. So because we know that the earlier the intervention, the more effective that it is. In a sense, policymakers are facing a self-regulation conflict of their own, because they can either act they can either act very early and improve self-regulation, or they can wait later until things get really bad and pay a lot in terms of societal costs and all kinds of different costs. So what's the take-home message? So basically, self-regulation is a really broad concept. Self-control, cognitive control, executive functions are all types of self-regulation in the literature. We have many challenges that still face us. One of the big ones is the lack of clarity. And we need some integration in our different models of self-regulation. We need to start looking more at early building blocks of self-regulation. And in terms of policy, we know that self-regulation is really important for later outcomes, that it's implicated in many disorders. We know that so far, some of our training and interventions for self-regulation are promising, but really the most promising, I think, is the interventions that involve early parenting interventions and sensitivity training, because one of the things we know is that intervening at the level of parenting has more of an impact than intervening at the level of the individual child. So thank you. And Aubrey finally got her cat.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the second speaker. And I'm especially pleased to introduce Professor Julia Karbar, as Julia and I have known each other since grad school. Julia is now a full professor at the University of Koblenz-Landau in Germany. She has wide research interests, including cognitive development across the lifespan, cognitive and neuroplasticity, executive functions, and she is a world-leading leader in the cognitive training literature across the lifespan. So Julia, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for this great introduction. I'm just trying to get my presentation started. All right. Should be working, does it? Okay. Well, as I said, thank you very much for the great introduction, also for the invite to this symposium, my first online symposium, I have to admit. So I'm pretty impressed how well that works, and that so many of you are joining us from all over the world, which is really just like a normal conference, just from our living room or wherever you are. So thank you for having me. Thank you for putting this together. And I hope I don't bore you, because Nancy has already tapped on many of the aspects that I will be talking about as well, but maybe a bit slightly different, maybe sometimes the same. But I'll try to share my ideas on self-regulation, cognitive control, and executive functions. And as you know from Nick's introduction, one of my main topics of research is cognitive training. So I will borrow some examples from the cognitive training literature to illustrate my main points. So if you first, the definition question, of course, which I will be also addressing. And if you look at the literature, then you will find that self-regulation has been defined as goal-directed behavior, often with a certain temporal perspective. And typical examples, as we've already heard, include personal strivings, achievement-related behavior, and the regulation of shared goals in social relationships. Executive functions. No? Yeah, executive functions, and I have to admit, from my view, the term executive functions is often used interchangeably with cognitive control. So I kind of summed up across those domains, even though that's probably not completely correct. But these are the more, as we have heard, more cool aspects of control, and they are defined as higher level control processes, supporting the adaptation to changing environmental demands or changing task demands. And according to Miyake and his colleagues, they comprise 3 core functions, namely working memory, inhibition, and flexibility. And both aspects of self-regulation and executive functions are core dimensions of adaptive human behavior. And they have been studied largely in parallel from, for instance, neurocognitive researchers, social psychologists, personality, developmental, educational, clinical psychology, but surprisingly, often without much communication between the fields. So there's a large overlap on the literature that's been labeled self-regulation and the one that has been labeled executive functions, even though some of the studies have actually touched very similar aspects of cognition. And in order to kind of get the dialogue between them, the fields starting, Hoffman and colleagues have proposed a framework a few years ago, which I find really handy. And they basically make 4 assumptions supporting the idea that maybe executive functions may subserve the development of self-regulation. First, they assume that the basic executive control processes support important mechanisms of goal pursuit, such as, for instance, shielding action goals from interference. Second, they assume that the more cool executive control aspects may help more hot, especially effective or motivational regulation processes, such as we have heard in Nancy's talk, unwanted cravings. Think of the chocolate cake example that we've just seen. The third assumption is, sorry, I have trouble clicking here. The third assumption is, as we have already heard in the previous talk, that impairments in executive functions, whether they are temporal, for instance, because of stress, or whether they are permanent because of some clinical condition, they are a risk factor for self-regulation failures. And finally, and this has also been talked about in the previous talk, we know that executive functions are trainable, at least to some degree. So you may assume that improvements in executive functions may also support self-regulation processes. And especially that last idea has inspired many studies over the last decade, as the community of cognitive training research has been grown exponentially. And also, it kind of makes sense to try and improve executive functions and self-regulation, because we know that they predict a number of important life outcomes, such as vocational or educational attainment, income, physical and psychological health, and social skills, and so on. However, in their article, Hoffman and colleagues also acknowledge that there is evidence for a more complex interplay of executive functions and self-regulations. So there are studies testing unidirectional relationships between self-regulation and executive functions, but also studies assuming that executive functions have a mediating or a moderating role between self-regulation and other variables, such as risk behavior or training, for instance. And I will try and spend the rest of the talk illustrating implications in scientific research, and also a little bit for policy making, by focusing on the example of executive function training. Now, most of the training studies, not only those training executive functions, basically any training study follows a similar logic. Participants are trained for a longer time on a given task. Let's assume a cognitive flexibility task. And over time, we would expect them to become better. That's pretty straightforward. If you do a task over and over again, of course, you will get better. What's more interesting and also more controversial is whether these gains on the training task generalize to other untrained tasks. And these tasks can either be tasks measuring the same construct, that's sometimes called near transfer, that would be transfer from one cognitive flexibility task to another cognitive flexibility task. But a transfer can also occur to other cognitive functions that are related to the one that has been trained. An example would be transfer of cognitive flexibility training to reading ability, for instance. And while there's pretty much consensus that training effects and also near transfer effects occur quite often, there's a heated debate on whether far transfer is possible and under which circumstances it occurs and after which type of training it is to be expected. It's a very heated debate. If you are following the training community, you know that these discussions are still ongoing. In any case, cognitive training studies can be very informative from different perspectives. From a theoretical point, they can help us identify the mechanisms underlying training and transfer effects. They can also help us sharpen the definition of cognitive constructs, such as we are doing today, self-control versus executive function, for instance. And also from a more applied perspective, they can help us design interventions in, for instance, clinical or educational settings. Now, I've already said training effects and near transfer effects are pretty well documented, but evidence for far transfer, which is like the holy grail of cognitive training research, is still mixed, even on the level of meta-analysis. And although the field of cognitive training research has made substantial progress over the last decade, a comprehensive understanding of how or for whom or why certain interventions can be effective is really still missing. And therefore, we recently proposed 3 important aspects that should be considered in ongoing training research in order to drive the field forward. First, we think that it is important to establish a mechanistic link between a training mechanism and a transfer domain. Second, we think that it's important to consider individual differences in the effectiveness of training interventions. And finally, we propose 2 theoretical perspectives of when and how particular interventions can be successful. And I will try and illustrate each of these 3 points very briefly over the next few slides. So first, well, the goal of most training studies, I assume, is to design a cognitive training that matches participants' needs and abilities and also maximizes individual benefits after the training. Therefore, we first need to understand the true relationship between the training mechanism and the outcome variable. It's not enough to know that they are somehow correlated. And in order to do that, generative computation models can be very handy because they allow parsing task performance into multiple distinct processes, and also they allow to assess the directionality between processes. And these computational modeling approaches can help us to identify which training mechanisms need to be targeted in order to affect specific outcome variables. Second, we need to make sure that manipulations of training variables lead to tangible outcomes. And that can be done by having true experimental manipulations, not only correlational evidence, as it has been done in many studies. The third point is related to change on the ability level. And in order to show change on the ability level, we need to assess the targeted ability by a range of tasks, not only one single indicator. And finally, we need an appropriate operationalization of training mechanisms in order to make sure that we really train capacities rather than just task performance. For instance, if our aim is to improve inhibitory control, we need to make sure that our training tasks really tap into inhibition and that we not just train response inhibition over the course of training. The second point, as I said before, is related to individual differences. And we know that state-of-the-art studies show, and that's the case in any training data set I have ever seen, that individuals respond very differently to the same intervention. So individual differences are massive. And to illustrate this, I brought you an example from one of our own studies. Here you see data from a study in which we trained cognitive flexibility in younger adults and older adults. And what you see here are the mean group differences from pre-test to post-test, and pretty much as expected, both age groups improved their performances as a function of training. But if you now look at individual performances, you will see that in both age groups, there are individuals that benefit massively while others don't improve at all. And that's very similar in most of the training studies we have been running so far. So the question really is, why do some individuals benefit more than others? And in the early training literature, there have been some really prominent accounts to explain this pattern of findings. And I brought examples for both of them. First here, you see an example for what we call a magnification or Matthew effect, basically indicating that higher cognitive baseline abilities go along with larger gains. Here you see data from a memory strategy training study on the method of loci. And as you see, the high performing young individuals benefit much more than the lower performing older ones. Yet, if you look at individual differences at post-test, you will see that there's a large overlap between age groups, and the high performing old adults easily outperform the low performing younger ones. The pretty much opposite effect is what we call a compensation effect, that is low cognitive baseline abilities go along with larger gains. Here's an example from one of our studies training cognitive flexibility. And as you can see, young children and older adults show larger training and transfer gains than high-performing young adults, indicating that low performers showed larger gains after this type of process-based executive function training. And this effect is also very training specific because it was not present in an active control condition. So it's not likely that it's due to unspecific effects, such as regression to the mean, for instance. And in fact, if you look at the literature, inter-individual differences in training gains often show these distinct patterns after different types of training. But recent studies also indicated that gains vary as a function of individual differences in age, motivation, personality, genetic predisposition, etc. Importantly, many of these studies indicate that often, especially low-performing individuals benefited massively from EF interventions. And surprisingly, these individual differences are often overlooked. That has to do with the analytical approach that most current studies have adopted, because they usually adopt a univariate approach, which is unable to identify, for instance, individual profiles of performance in multivariate data sets. If you opt for an analysis of individual differences, multivariate analysis allow to study individual differences in gains, and also training-related changes in task relationships, which can also be very informative regarding the mechanisms underlying training and transfer effects. And aside from these inter-individual differences, also looking at intra-individual differences and dynamics makes a lot of sense. Intra-individual performance trajectories across training sessions reveal, for instance, which participants showed training effects at all, or when they reach their individual maximum performance. This can, for instance, be indicative of varying strategies or vulnerability to disturbing influences. And looking at intra-individual couplings of performance fluctuations with other variables, such as, for instance, stress or motivation or sleep, can tell us a lot about the factors that contribute to individual differences in training-related outcomes. And I think this may also maybe help to explain the heterogeneity of findings even in meta-analysis, because looking at mean changes on the group level and then averaging across their effect sizes really does not do any justice to individual differences that we so often observe. So the third pillar of our proposal basically is related to the theoretical frameworks in training research. And we know that recently Bayesian learning accounts have been used to study the evolution of developmental plasticity. And one prediction of this framework is that interventions that are very, very different from real-life cognitive demands that individuals are faced with that tap executive functions, they tend to have limited or maybe even no impact. And that means that the context of the training has particular relevance. And indeed, we know that there are studies indicating that isolated interventions focusing only on specific aspects of cognition without any embedding lead to limited transfer, whereas interventions that are contextualized in terms of how or when they are delivered are shown to be more effective. That's, for instance, the case in the project I just finished with Nick, where we tried to take an EF training into the school, train kids in diets, and focus on metacognitive aspects of the training, not only on process-based executive control traits. Okay, so what does that mean for the dialogue with policymakers? I'm not very experienced in talking to politicians about the implications of our work, but I do think that it's very important. And the first thing as a researcher that comes to mind as well, we need money for studies. That's probably something everyone can relate to, but I think in this context, especially relevant, because state-of-the-art studies focusing on the longevity of effects, on individual differences, on training trajectories, they need large samples. And it's often more that one lab can handle. So funding for large and multi-centered studies and the assessment of longitudinal effects would really improve a lot, will improve our understanding a lot. The second thing I was talking about was that obviously our research has a lot of implications for education. And one thing that came to mind is that it's very, very important that we need to implement knowledge regarding the role of self-regulation and executive functions in teacher training curricula. At least in the German system, teachers in kindergarten as well as in primary or secondary school, they know scarily little about self-regulation or executive functions, let alone ways to assess or improve them. And even if they do, they rarely have the conditions to account for individual differences in the classroom, because groups are simply too large and the student populations are way too heterogeneous.
Sorry for interruption, Julia, 2 minutes left.
Yeah, that works out well, thank you. So I think providing early tailored individual interventions designed to improve self-regulation and executive functions and the abilities on building on them is key, as Nancy already said in her presentation. I couldn't agree more. So to conclude and sum up, from what we know from our research and lots of other studies, executive functions and self-regulation do have a large overlap conceptually, and there is evidence that one may subserve the other, but I think the jury is really still out on what the exact link between the concepts really is. We also know, and that's a very important point, that both self-regulation and executive functions predict a number of important life outcomes. That leads us to the need of tailored interventions, to early interventions. And I mean, I have been talking about cognitive training, but these interventions can comprise many types of interventions, not only cognitive training. There's also evidence that physical training improves executive control, mindfulness training, parent-centered interventions, metacognitive training. So there's lots of different ways we can go in terms of interventions. One thing that is particularly striking to me is that we see in our data, and other labs see that as well, that EF intervention often show the largest effects in those at risk. For instance, kids from low SES families or those with developmental disorders. So in a sense, interventions that effectively improve executive functions may contribute to compensating at least some of the risk factors for these kids. And I think everything that does this is worth a further examination. So again, I've said this before, but I will repeat it because I think it's super important. We still need to learn a lot more about this, and we need to get to a comprehensive understanding of how, for whom, and why certain interventions can be effective. And that means that we need to learn more about the mechanisms underlying cognitive plasticity. We need to know more about individual differences, and we need to refine our theoretical approaches of assessment. Then, in the end, I would like to thank everyone contributing to our research, my team, of course, and I'm happy to answer your questions later.
Thank you, Julia, for your thoughtful presentation. Let me introduce now the next speakers. Rebecca Bailey and Stephanie Jones. Rebecca Bailey is Assistant Director of the ESOL Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on two areas: the development of executive function, self-regulation, and social emotional skills across early and middle school, with an emphasis on understanding how poverty and trauma impact brain development and learning, and the design, implementation, and evaluation of SEAL programs and strategies in both USA and international settings. And Stephanie Jones is the Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Child Development and Education and Director of the ESOL Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research, anchored in prevention science, focuses on the effects of poverty and exposure to violence on social, emotional, and behavioral development from early childhood to early adolescence. Over the past 10 years, her work has centered on evaluation research addressing the impact of preschool and elementary level social emotional learning interventions on behavioral and academic outcomes and classroom practices, as well as new curriculum development, implementation, and testing. The room is yours, Stephanie and Rebecca.
Thank you very much. I'll share. It's going to start.
We're gonna work together on this. So great. So our lab's work focuses on translating science for practice, and as Sebastian mentioned, our team really focuses on social emotional development and social emotional learning, often called SEL. And we have a number of projects focused on self-regulation and executive function. And I'll say in the past 10 years, we've gotten very deep into the self-regulation literature. We've been really interested in it. And so Stephanie, if you go ahead and click, thank you. And you can, thank you. You can go ahead. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a project that we started maybe about 7 years ago, really wanting to understand the literature on executive function and self-regulation. We were interested in it because of its links to school readiness and school success and other positive life outcomes for children and youth. And we were designing an intervention for early childhood and elementary grades, a school-based intervention. And the literature that we were looking at had a lot of emphasis on self-regulation, executive function, and effortful control. And also many other constructs, many other terms and skills that were similar, such as behavior regulation, cognitive control, emotion regulation, and many, many other terms. And so we noticed that researchers in this area were using many different definitions, many different descriptions, many different conceptualizations and measures to talk about and describe and assess this area of children's development. And so we got really interested in the terminology and the measures, and proposed a project designed to look deeply at this area of research and really think about how can we identify and define and try to untangle the different terms or constructs that are related. And so that project is called the EF Mapping Project, and I'm going to share a few slides from our work on it, and you can find that report. We can share links later. But so what we really kind of started with is seeing that there were a lot of similar constructs that had overlapping or very related elements, but also had some important distinctions, and that those distinctions seemed really important for education and other applied developmental science. So Steph, you can change the slide. Thank you. So this is a list of some of the terms that we came across in our literature review. So I think here there is over 45 terms, and this is not a comprehensive list. So others have done some similar work and shown that there's just a tremendous amount of terms and skills that are used to describe the category of self-regulation. And so you see some of the things that Julia and Nancy have already talked about: inhibition, inhibitory control, response inhibition. You see some variation around whether it's simple or complex or hot or cool. But really what we saw is that a wide variety of terminology is used, and sometimes the same terms are defined in the same ways, and sometimes they're used in different ways, and sometimes they're measured in very different ways. And that tends to follow some research tradition lines, meaning cognitive neuroscientists have certain methods and approaches that you tend to see in that body of literature, whereas clinical psychology or education research tends to use some other definitions and other measures. But really what we were interested in is, wow, there's this rich, diverse body of literature on this area of self-regulation, and can we make sense of how these different skills are related to one another and influence children's development? Click. So we began to develop some heuristics to try to organize the literature and organize the terminology. And so this is one of the heuristics that we created to try and represent a pattern that we were seeing. So what you see here is up at the top, the key term is executive function. And what that means is when we searched papers using search term executive function, we tended to find papers with this range and this set of constructs being described and measured. So in that second row, what we've called the subcomponents, many papers would describe executive function as being comprised of these components: response inhibition, working memory, and set shifting or cognitive flexibility. But beyond that, there were a number of other constructs that would often come up, and some of them seemed proximal to those subcomponents, meaning that they were defined or measured in similar ways, such as planning or problem solving, sometimes error monitoring. And then there were other terms that would come up, but were often described and defined in increasingly different ways from the core term of executive function. So this might include things like reflection and creativity. And so we started to organize these as simple skills, what we saw as the subcomponents, and then more complex skills, which we saw as building on and using those simple skills, but being increasingly different. Click. And then looking into the effortful control literature, we saw a similar pattern emerging, almost like a similar structure to the types of terms and measures being used. So again, up at the top, you see effortful control, and then the subcomponents, inhibitory control, attention shifting, and then a set of more complex skills, including things like delay of gratification, emotion regulation, grit, and resilience. Click. And so what we have attempted to do is we sort of lined up these different heuristics together and looked at their structures and saw quite parallel structures in these two bodies of literature. And so what we noticed is that they both tend to have simple skills that are really the subcomponents, or if you could break apart executive function into its parts, these subcomponent skills, and that they line up in interesting ways with some of the subcomponents in the effortful control literature. So you see a focus on inhibition, and you see a focus on some kind of shifting or flexibility. The main difference between the two bodies of research being that executive function also really had a strong focus on working memory, which you don't tend to see in the effortful control literature. And effortful control really often describes the use of these skills in emotionally salient contexts. So dealing with frustration or desire or needing to regulate emotions, or doing so in everyday tasks and environments. So the measures that are used in effortful control literature sometimes include more observational measures, such as teacher reports and parent reports of children's behavior about everyday tasks, including things like working with others and taking turns. So you see more of these kind of social and emotional aspects in the effortful control literature, where you see more focus on the cognitive elements in the executive function literature. And I'll just highlight that at the bottom here, what we're trying to represent with the self-regulation and self-control is the idea that what we saw often is that the concepts of self-regulation or self-control tended to operate in a larger umbrella fashion. So including some of those executive function or core components, but often involving other aspects and other skills as well. So things like conscientiousness and other concepts that tend to bring more into the research than just the executive functions. So Steph, do you want to?
Yes, okay. So thank you, Becca. Great setup. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to implications for scientific research. And I want to emphasize a couple of things that Becca said, which is that our work is about bringing science to bear on strategies and practices for the world. And in order to do that effectively, in our view, we have to be really specific, precise, clear, and transparent about what we are targeting. And then we have to think about those things in the real world as behaviors that we can see, and that we can see change when we do things that are tied to them. So a lot of our efforts are directed toward both trying to parse the literature toward more effective practices, to designing those tailored interventions that you ended with, Julia, and at the same time, think the other direction, which is like, okay, if we developed an integrated model for self-regulation that is going to drive our application, drive the design, the delivery of stuff in the real world, what does that then demand that we need to know? So does it set up a set of new questions that we can then build a next generation of science on top of? And so what I'm going to go to next is a little bit about that. And then we're going to end with a kind of general summary of the kinds of interventions and strategies that we've developed based on these models. And so what I'm doing now is trying to bring together Becca's really great description of how we've tried to parse the literature into a model that we call an integrated model that we describe in a paper that came out in 2019 in Clinical Child and Family Psychology Review. I can never remember the name, but it was a special issue on self-regulation. This is a model that tries to bring together these ideas and these literatures so that we could then design strategies and practices in a manner that is close to the scientific end of things. And this is where we began. So our question was really, how do we bring these bodies of work together in a way that both honors, organizes, and then integrates this vast body of literature into some kind of schema that can then drive the design of strategies and practices. And so you can think about this as yet another heuristic that brings together regulation-related processes, skills, and areas of functioning. And it's a way for us to think about research on the one hand and practice on the other. And so what you see here, again, very consistent with your presentation, Julia, we have foundational skills, which are those sort of core EFs that you might imagine are sitting as sort of core brain processes that get increasingly coordinated over time in behavior, in a cognitive domain, an emotion domain, and a social domain, which then with development and experience in the world sort of form a regulatory gestalt, like a coordinating body. And what's really important about this model, in my view, for us, is the part in the middle, which are these regulatory domains. And we define cognitive regulation, emotion regulation, and social regulation in these ways. You see the definitions in the middle. Cognitive is managing and modulating thoughts, attention, and related behaviors. But it has very clear examples of domain-specific behaviors and tasks, like planning and organizing, problem solving, and setting goals. In the middle, for emotion regulation, managing and modulating internal feeling states, related behaviors. We have emotion knowledge and expression, emotion and behavior regulation, empathy and perspective taking. Those are examples of those behaviors. In the social domain, managing and modulating interpersonal relationships and social interactions. And we have related domain-specific skills, behaviors, and so on. What's key here is that this is a way for us to bring together these complex bodies of literature in the world of practice. What educators are asking for, or policymakers even, are practices and strategies that build planning and problem-solving skills, that build conflict resolution skills. They're not actually always saying that they want strategies and practices that are about building working memory. And so what we wanted to do is to try and bring together these bodies of literature so we could kind of build a map that would then allow us to see how is planning and organizing tied back to those core executive functions. So that's why we spend so much time in these heuristics. Some people don't like them. We love them. We love to get things into integrated models. Okay, so as many of you are, we are developmentalists. We try and think about these models over time and try and understand, developmental processes and how they might play out in a model like this. And so our question here was, how does theory and research tell us about what skills emerge first, what lays the foundation for what in this broad domain, and how does that play out over time? And so we kind of cast our model out across time with this notion of generic regulatory skills very, very early on that get differentiated through processes of differentiation and hierarchical integration into these core executive functions that then play out in behaviors and skills and knowledge in the regulatory domains that then become increasingly coordinated over time. And so you see at the bottom, we have kind of a developmental story about this. And I'm going to just give you an example of sort of both looking in and looking out about how we see that. So this is an example of that general idea of differentiation and hierarchical integration. And this goes very close in the early childhood period and focuses on those core EFs. And here we have kind of generic regulatory skills like inhibition, which become differentiated in the very early childhood years to these discrete EF components and then further differentiate. This is our read of the many papers that try and parse these components in early childhood. What you don't see here is that attention component, which runs all the way along and sort of in a quantitative, incremental way, just expands over time and supports all of these things. And then here we have another example of this model, but getting sort of inside it to see how it plays out in one of the domains. And this is just an example of how these core regulatory processes get integrated with social knowledge, skills, and experiences to produce increasingly sophisticated social behavior over time. So we could just play this out with some concepts that are out in the literature. Here we have regulation as a single unitary construct. Let's say it's self-control. In early childhood, theory of mind emerges, and you can understand it as a child using inhibitory control to refrain from thinking about self in order to think about the thoughts and perspectives of others. So here we see this core EF intersecting with a very early social construct. And then that goes on with increasing knowledge about body language, facial expressions, and the social cues of others through experience in the world. And increasing practice with effective conflict resolution, this enables children to better regulate their own thinking, their sort of interpretations and attributions about the behavior and practices of others. And this is all playing out in social situations. So it's really a very dynamic set of models and ideas that gets us into the constructs that are playing out in children's behavior in the real world that we want to design interventions around. So here's the part where it's kind of a pivot to like, what are the things we don't really know? So as developmentalists, we always think, you know, developmentally again, and we ask ourselves questions about things like heterotypic and homotypic continuity, which is like, are there stronger links within domain than there are across domain? But really importantly, how do those cross-domain associations play out? And our other presenters raised the kinds of issues that make this challenging, which is that we need really sophisticated longitudinal studies in context to do this kind of work. And we need measures that are stable over time, but nonetheless capture age-specific variations in these very skills, or we need methodological tools that allow us to more effectively and with more confidence knit together developmental trajectories that comprise different measurement tools of these.
Sorry for the interruption, Stephanie, 2 minutes left.
2 minutes? Did I go?
Yes.
I did. Okay, last one. So this is just a way of depicting where researchers sit in all of this work. And there are researchers who focus on temperament and reactivity. There are researchers who focus on these core regulatory processes. The point here is that if we're going to go toward intervention, we have to think about each of these levels. And in some ways, we have to think about the top level most importantly, which is how all of these regulatory behaviors and processes play out in dynamic interaction with context. And this gets us back to Becca, who will quickly summarize our strategies and practices that we've done.
Sure. Will you click to that first slide? Yes, one. Great. So for us, the implications are that we need to think about multiple domains of children's development. So the executive function literature and the construct itself tells us a great deal about important cognitive skills and basic capacities. And we also need to understand how it is related to regulatory skills across cognitive, social, and emotion domains, because those are the skills that kids need to bring into the classroom and into their environments and interactions every day. So understanding and thinking about how those are coordinated for a child in the context. And that we need to design interventions and policies that are developmentally appropriate. So we know that executive function and self-regulation is changing rapidly throughout early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and really, as others have said, need really strong developmental literature and studies to help us inform and target stage salient features of this area of children's development. We also need to think about children and adults together. So there's a lot of literature on executive function and self-regulation showing both, Nancy talked about the dyadic interactions and the role of adults in shaping children's development of these skills and their use of them. And so our interventions and policies, speaking of, should consider children, teacher, and parent needs as a way to really think about how best to support children and that dyad. And then finally, to think about the system. So thinking about not just the individual skills, but also the environment. So what are the supports and the stressors that influence both children and adults' ability to use these skills in the moment? And so really thinking about aligning our policies and supports across those different kinds of environments and settings. And I think we might hit time, so.
Well, I will just tell a couple of things about our approach to intervention in this area, which is to, as I said before, to be very precisely focused on specific EF core processes, but also these other aspects of regulatory skills across those domains. And we've developed a set of strategies and practices that are tailored, meaning they're quite specific, they're short, they're highly doable, and they can be done across all different kinds of contexts. One example is something called brain games, not new in EF applied work, but designed to be highly doable and highly specific and extremely fun for kids and adults to do together. And we've designed and implemented these brain games in all kinds of different settings, both domestically and abroad, and done a number of observational, quasi-experimental, and more recently experimental studies at them, and have found in a classroom randomized study that we completed a year ago or so that playing these games improves children's core executive function and self-regulation skills across many domains. And there's some evidence that it improves other kinds of academic skills in school, particularly for high-risk kids. They look like this. We've also built related strategies and tools that are about those more complex regulatory skills in the cognitive, social, and emotional domain. We tend to call these things SEL, social emotional learning kernels, because they're not programs or curricula, they're strategies and practices that can be chosen and implemented pretty much anywhere. So we're happy to answer questions about those applications, and I assume we'll all share our slides because we included some links to things that are how we think about our work in relation to policy, but also other things that are tied to measurement, to some of this definitional stuff, and so on. I'll stop there.
So thanks very much, Professor Bailey and Jones. We are now finally present the last speaker, Professor Sabine Rebel. Sabine leads the Development Minds Lab in the Department of Psychology at George Mason University. She conducts research on cognitive development in early childhood, with much of her research to date focusing on the development of executive function. She's particularly interested in developmental change in social cognition, self-understanding, and executive processes. She's also doing work to promote open science practices in developmental psychology, with the goal of making it easier for researchers to build on one another's work. Professor Dover shared her presentation in the following video, and if possible, she will also be able for the question session. So I will share her video.
So thank you to Soledad, Sebastian, and Nick for inviting me to give this talk and for organizing this symposium. My talk is entitled Rethinking Executive Function and Its Development. So when defining executive function, it can help to think about how it might go wrong in everyday life. For example, you might have a goal and go on autopilot and then fail to achieve that goal. Or you may succumb to an impulse and eat some cake instead of sticking to a diet. Or immersing yourself in activity and not noticing that time has passed by and you've totally forgotten to do something that you plan to do. Or giving up quickly on a difficult task in favor of doing something that's easier or more instantly gratifying. Executive function likely comes into play in all of these kinds of scenarios, and obviously a lot more. Okay, so of course from there we need a more formal definition, and instead of giving you my own definition or my preferred definition, I'm going to start with how executive function is most commonly defined and work through some of the implications and then question that definition a bit. Now, how is it most commonly defined? Well, at the most broad level, it's the ability to control one's thoughts and behaviors, but this usually quickly gets broken down into 3 domain general components that support engaging in goal-directed behavior. So working memory, inhibitory control, and shifting. Now, why is it defined in this way? Well, of course, there's Miyake and colleagues' seminal paper that found the 3 separable but related factors. This way of thinking about executive function also has origins in neuropsychology and tasks that have face validity as measures of prefrontal deficits or perseveration. It's also a very tractable definition. So there are many suitable measures, as even in the developmental literature, and there really isn't anything that's not easily measured, like consciousness. So that kind of gets left out of the definition. And even more important, there's no homunculus. So there's no little person behind the scenes doing mysterious things that allow us to accomplish all these complex goals. Finally, it's predictive. So it relates to concurrent and longitudinal outcomes. So to bring this to life, I want to walk you through a very widely used measure of executive function in childhood that is kind of thought of as an adapted version of an adult neuropsychology task, the Wisconsin card sorting task. And this task is thought to kind of tap those 3 different components that I was just talking about. So what happens is the child is asked to sort some cards that are shown at the bottom of the screen by 1 dimension. So for example, shape. So the child will sort these cards multiple times until they build up a habit or a prepotent response. And then the child will be asked to switch and sort the same cards in a different way. So for example, by color. And it doesn't really matter which dimension you start with or if you use different dimensions entirely. You usually still see the same kind of phenomenon. And now, I'm going to show you a typical 3-year-old completing the card sorting task.
If it's blue, put it here. If it's red, put it here. Here's a blue one. Okay, so now we're going to play a different game. We're not going to play the color game anymore. Now we're going to play the shape game. And in the shape game, all the stars go here and all the trucks go here. Okay? Stars go here, trucks go here. Where did the stars go? And where did the trucks go? Excellent. Okay. Stars go here, trucks go here. Here's a truck. Stars go here, trucks go here. Here's a star.
So as you can see, she struggles to switch to sorting the cards in the new way, and despite being reminded of how to sort. And this matches what we've seen across many, many studies where very younger children, around 3 years of age, struggle to switch. So these gray dots on this graph represent individual studies. On the y-axis is the proportion switching, and on the x-axis is the mean age of the sample. And you can see where the red crosshairs are, that a 3-year-old is generally not doing that well on the task, although of course there are a lot of individual differences or group differences. By 5 years of age, children are actually sorting much better and switching at a higher rate. And it's a really robust correlation with age. So now I want to talk about some ideas that kind of go together with this common view of executive function as these 3 components. So one idea is that these executive function components are building blocks of more complex executive functions and real-world behaviors. So for example, planning, problem solving, self-regulation, self-control, that these components are kind of the core skills that then support these more complex abilities. Another idea that follows from this common view is that executive function components support other important developments. So for example, theory of mind, which has been measured using the false belief task. So you might interpret successful performance on the false belief task in terms of working memory, so being able to maintain in mind what happened and who saw what, inhibitory control, so being able to inhibit one's own prepotent response or habit to think of their own perspective on an event, and then being able to shift to thinking about thinking from another person's perspective. Along the same lines, executive function components are thought to support other important developments. So for example, academic achievement. So here's a schematic of how this is typically conceptualized with reference to children who are struggling. So poverty-related stressors could affect or have a negative effect on the brain, which then influences executive function, those three components, and then thereby affects outcomes like academic achievement, social outcomes, and health outcomes. Yet another idea is that executive function components can be targeted in training. So for example, one would engage the executive function component in some specific way, so through computerized training, martial arts, or pretend play. Those are just a few examples. And then this would then strengthen the executive function component, not unlike a muscle, and then you would see improvements in other domains like conceptual development, academic outcomes, complex executive functions like I've discussed so far. But there are some problems with this common view, and I'm just going to go through a few of them. First, executive function measures are not always related to one another. They are also not consistently related to measures of self-control. And training executive function components may not transfer broadly. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Miyake and colleagues' paper does not actually show that executive function is three components. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the tasks that were included in Miyake and colleagues' paper were selected based on specific considerations. So the availability of multiple exemplars and task simplicity, so their plausibility as building blocks of executive function. But this analysis did not demonstrate that these are the components of executive function. So we really probably should stop treating them like that. They actually found evidence for unity, so a common EF factor, and then also diversity. So these three other factors. However, subsequent analyses have found different factors, and even Miyake and colleagues have updated their model so that it's two factors and a common EF. But hypothetically, if you put different measures into the analysis as well, you might find different factors. So for example, if you put delay measures into the analysis, you might find a separable delay factor, or you could, the same thing with planning tasks. If you had a whole bunch of planning tasks and put them in, you might find a separable planning factor, and so on. But really importantly, the task impurity argument assumes that task-specific demands are not relevant to assessing executive function skills. And I really want to challenge this point specifically. And this point actually may be an extension of this idea that decontextualized tasks in a controlled environment are actually purer measures of executive function. And again, I want to call this into question. So I am offering a different view, that executive function is not actually reducible to a few component processes. Rather, it's best understood as conscious voluntary control engaged over a range of processes, basic processes, in the service of goals. And so this could manifest in many, many ways. And this is just like a non-exhaustive list of all the different ways that you can use conscious control. And I'm trying to argue that you can't reduce these down to a few components. I think that this has been a goal of the field for a long time. And part of this is because of wanting to get rid of this homunculus And I just think that instead of trying to pursue this, we need to just admit that executive function or conscious control is extremely diverse in how it is expressed. And not only that, but it will be influenced by the particular situation and the knowledge and values and beliefs and interests that come into play in that particular situation. So as a concrete example, let's go back to the dimensional change card sorting task and how we can interpret performance on this task. So typically, when you see individual differences on this task and other lab tasks, we might think of a low score as exemplifying a deficit. But I think that there are lots of other ways that we can interpret performance on the task. So for example, limited conceptual knowledge or experience, so sorting by shapes and colors. Limited value placed on using control in the current context. So this idea that it's important to use effort on an assigned task. The child may have limited insight into what the experimenter is expecting, or that the experimenter is making out evaluations of their performance. And they might have limited expectations about the task itself, so that the task is challenging and that vigilance is needed. And finally, they might have limited expectations about rewards for performing well on this task. And these are just a few examples. And what I'd like to suggest is that these aren't noise that needs to be parceled out of understanding performance. And it's actually relevant to understanding how children engage executive function in real situations and how they do so successfully. As another example, I want to talk about about delaying gratification, which can be thought of as an instance of engaging control in order to resist an available reward in favor of a delayed but more satisfying reward. So the classic marshmallow task is where children are offered one marshmallow, or if they can wait for the experimenter to go get more marshmallows, they can have two instead. And in a study I did recently, we actually looked at whether children would wait longer if they believed that other members of their group waited. So, for example, children were assigned to an in-group weighted condition in which their group waited for two marshmallows and another group did not. They took the marshmallow right away. Or they were assigned to an in-group didn't wait condition where their group did not wait for the two marshmallows. They had the one marshmallow right away, whereas the other group waited. And then children were left to wait, and we looked at how long they were able to wait. And what we found was that children who believed that their group waited for two marshmallows were able themselves to wait longer. And I found this across two different studies. And this is really one of many studies now that has shown that knowledge and beliefs can influence how children delay on the marshmallow tasks. So for example, the race of the experimenter and the reliability of the environment and the reliability of the experimenter, or beliefs about those things, really affect how long children will delay on the marshmallow task. Children's desire to cooperate with their peers and their reputational concerns, so their beliefs about who will know how long they waited. These also influence children's delaying on the task. And again, on the old view, it might have been said that these are just a noise when we're trying to get at real executive ability. But I argue that this is the wrong way to think about it, that these things actually help to explain whether a child will engage control or engage the control that they have to muster, and even how successfully they will do so. So I want to close by providing a few different implications of the proposed view. So how should we measure executive function if we're interested in self-regulation in everyday contexts? Well, what's tapped by tasks versus questionnaires is being actively debated. But I would suggest that questionnaires may assess skill in engaging control across many everyday situations. And so it's something that we should think about when we are asking a research question. We should not assume that these canonical laboratory measures are are going to be assessing executive function in the way that matters. Questionnaires may be particularly sensitive to individual differences in emotion response, and that may be quite important. And I think that this has not been emphasized enough in the traditional executive function literature, which tends to be more focused on executive function as a pure cognitive ability. Now, the latent variables that you can get from the tasks may capture something that's more cognitive, but undoubtedly knowledge, beliefs, and values are coming into play, whether we know it or not. So how should we train executive function to support real-world functioning? I would argue that we should focus on knowledge, beliefs, and values that are likely to apply across contexts. Instead of trying to train executive function components. So for example, if we're interested in supporting math ability, we might practice engaging control to complete basic numeracy activities, so counting and focusing on quantity. We might cultivate values related to using effort and delaying gratification, and fostering beliefs that using effort results in good outcomes. And this doesn't really follow from my view, but I think it's important to target factors that are going to affect healthy emotional and cognitive functioning, like sleep, nutrition, and stress. It's undeniable that if these are not addressed, children are going to struggle with executive functioning in multiple domains of life. Another question is how we should interpret predictive relations between tasks and outcomes. So for example, when an executive function task predicts some outcome that we care about, like academic achievement, what does this mean? So one way to interpret it on the common view is that the EF component ability, like working memory, supports math skills and math achievement. But I would argue that this isn't really the best way to interpret this. Instead, I would suggest that children have skills in using control in relevant ways, like they develop skills in using control to count and to manipulate numbers in mind, and that this is what is supporting their math skills and math achievement. I also think that we need to rethink the deficit model and not assume that scores on lab tasks reflect deficits or lack thereof. Now, I think part of this is inherited from this idea that children can be compared to patients who have frontal deficits in terms of how they perform on tasks. And, we use the language that children perseverate on these tasks. But I think that this might actually be the wrong way of looking at it. And I also think that we need to be sensitive to children's cultural and socioeconomic contexts when we think about their performance and when we try to understand what the task means for them. And also consider more ecologically valid measures of executive function that assess control in a way that is meaningful and valued from the perspective of the child's sociocultural context. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and I would also like to let you know that what I've said today is a summary of ideas that I have expressed elsewhere in a recent paper. So if you would like to see a more thorough treatment, please do download the paper for free at the link I've provided on my website. And I also wanted to give a plug of another recent perspective that was written in kind of a response to my paper, but it's also a very different, refreshing view on executive function, and you can find the free copy of that paper at the link provided.
Thank you, Sabine, for your presentation.
Yes, so I'd like to thank all the speakers today for their very interesting talks and for giving us so much food for thoughts. I'm going to try to keep my discussion as short as possible so that we can move on more quickly to the Q&A and have more time for that. But I think that one of the highlights of this series of talks is that we are really moving towards more conceptual clarity. This has been stressed by Rebecca and Stephanie. This conceptual clarity is actually really important if we want to have some impact in terms of policy making. And in particular, across the talks, there was a consensus about the relation between EF and self-regulation, with the idea that EF is a building block of self-regulation. Of course, there are some divergences in terms of the specific models that the speakers presented, but this consensus is actually really nice. Nancy stressed that indeed there is perhaps more divergence when it comes to articulating the hot and cool aspects of self-regulation. So this is definitely something that we need to work towards in the future. I think we also need to keep working towards more conceptual clarity, even among some basic aspects of executive functioning and self-regulation, and even among concepts like executive functioning, attention, and working memory. So obviously they are closely interrelated, but do we think that executive processes actually support selective attention and focused attention? Or do we think that focused and selective attention are actually executive components of their own? And similarly, do we think that executive functioning is a subcomponent of working memory, like it is often assumed in the working memory literature? Or do we think that working memory is a subcomponent of executive function, like we often assume in the developmental psychology literature? And in the latter case, what do we mean by working memory? Do we mean updating of information in working memory? Or do we mean maintenance of information in working memory? Maybe both. So these are things that we really need to clarify if in order to move the field forward, I think. And we also need to clarify how executive function actually relates to other cognitive abilities, like processing speed, especially early in childhood, intelligence, obviously, and metacognition. Metacognition, I think, is a particularly interesting one, because if you look at the literature on metacognition, then what you see is that the models about metacognitive development emphasize some aspects of metacognition, and in particular some procedural aspects of metacognition that are very similar, if not completely identical, to executive function. And authors in that literature argue that metacognitive development builds on executive functioning progress during childhood. What is interesting to me is that in the EF literature, recently we have observed that gains in EF during childhood actually build on gains in metacognition, and in particular that children show greater metacognitive reflection on task demands and on how to best meet those demands. And so they more flexibly engage different control strategies as a function of task demands, showing greater metacognitive reflection. So maybe there is some kind of bidirectional influence between the two. And this is something that I believe should be clarified in future. I think that another highlight of this series of talk is the invitation to reconsider the distinction among what is now commonly viewed as the three main aspects of executive function: inhibition, shifting, working memory. So this distinction is deeply rooted in the unity and diversity model of executive functioning by Miyake, Friedman, and their collaborators. And this model has been extremely positive because it has helped people conceptualize executive functioning. It has generated a lot of research, but there may be a downside, which Sabine emphasized in her talk, in that this model has severely restricted the way we conceptualize executive functioning. So Sabine emphasized that indeed the model wasn't meant to be exhaustive in terms of the different executive processes. And I believe it is also often kind of misinterpreted in that people tend to overlook the unity aspect of the model. Even though Miyake and Friedman proposed a revised version of the model in which they really emphasize the common EF ability. So we don't really know what this or those common EF abilities are, but they are very likely to include things like processes related to goal identification, goal maintenance, context monitoring, conflict detection, error monitoring. And those abilities, which are transversal to many different tasks measuring executive functioning, are very likely to play a major role in executive function development, and I believe should not be overlooked. And I was very pleased to hear Sabine propose that there may be a greater variety of executive processes contributing to executive functioning, and that those processes are probably engaged differently depending on the specifics of the context. So I think that this really points towards the necessity to really have a plurality of views and theoretical models, and to use those different theoretical models to move the literature forward. Another highlight of the series of talks is that they emphasize again that context really matters when it comes to understanding executive function and its development, and when it comes to understanding how to measure it, because obviously EF performance depends on the specific task demands that children face in a task. So two tasks that measure the same ability, let's say response inhibition, are not necessarily passed at the same age, right? Because it really depends on the level of interference that children are facing in each of those tasks. And the speakers really reminded us that EF performance also is highly dependent on non-executive factors in those tasks related to values, knowledge, motivation, that are really crucial for succeeding in these tasks, and that we tend to overlook. And this has really important implications in terms of interpreting how we assess executive function in children, both in terms of individual differences and developmental trajectories. It's difficult to really to say anything about the developmental trajectory of EF based on, just a couple of tasks. And those differences may indeed relate to non-executive factors involved in the task. And finally, I think that another highlight of this series of talks is that we can really draw a firm conclusion about interventions targeting EF and self-regulation. And the conclusion is that when it comes to interventions, one size doesn't fit all at all. And there is a need to tailor interventions as a function of each child's needs. So Julia emphasized that we really need to have a clear theoretical perspective on how and when to intervene. And luckily, all the talks today provided some elements of response, some elements that help us decide how and when to intervene. So Nancy really stressed that we need to intervene as early as possible and consider sensitive periods. We need to target stage salient features. We need to include knowledge, beliefs that apply across contexts, so that we can help generalization of newly acquired skills to new contexts. We need to have trainings that are contextualized, and we need to take individual differences seriously. And perhaps the most effective interventions may combine different approaches not only approaches that try to train abilities in children, but also approaches that try to modify the environment in order to facilitate EF engagement at home and at school by involving adults that interact with children, parents, and teachers. So I really think that these are some of the main highlights of this series of talks, like moving towards greater conceptual clarification, having a greater plurality of views when it comes to the conceptualization of EF, and finally having this clear conclusion about interventions that we really need to tailor it to each child's special needs. So I'm just going to leave it to that so that we can now move on to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for your excellent discussion. Incredible, yes. So let me begin the question and answer session. The first question, we identify and we ask to all the speakers. Remember that any of one can answer it or comment on each question, but please take a couple of 1 or 2 minutes each one to go ahead with more questions. The first one is, what are the most important hypotheses regarding the mechanisms of changes of self-regulatory and executive function skills during development? And in such sense, how can we increase the evidence for causal connections? Who wants to begin?
Can you say the question again?
Yeah, sorry. What are the most important hypotheses regarding the mechanisms of the changes of self-regulatory and executive function skills during development? And in such sense, thinking in mechanisms, how can we increase the evidence for causal connections? It's a question about causality. Okay. It's not an easy one, I know.
I can start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think that, like I said in my talk, I really like Jiva and Feldman's model, because they've also done a series of study looking at specific interventions, like the kangaroo skin-to-skin contact, that they had one group where they had skin-to-skin contact, and this increased the physiological regulation and then the executive function. So I think that these kinds of experimental or quasi-experimental studies can be very helpful. And I think, like, when you have an overall model like that, they've also have correlational data. But I do think that the experimental data, when we can get it, is probably the way to go. Perhaps even relying on some of the animal literature as well, because they can do direct experiment that we can't do for human beings, obviously. So yeah, so I'm thinking, like, I really like the idea of looking very early on, but also as well looking through development for different mechanisms, because I think different mechanisms operate through development.
Thank you, Nancy. Who else?
I guess I would add that I think we have to spend time on developmental mechanisms, and I like your idea about, and your sort of discussion of physiological regulation as a potential developmental mechanism that we could target, or a lever that we might target. I think we have to think about contextual mechanisms too. So while I am, fully on board with the notion that we might design and develop something and test it through an experiment, either a field experiment or a lab experiment, I think we have to think really carefully about the conditions out in the world where we expect people, little people, to enact the things that we think they know how to do. And so until we get really precise about those developmental, the individually oriented developmental mechanisms and those sort of key contextual mechanisms that enable or impede the use of behaviors like that we want to see, we're only going to be halfway there. So, we need a science. I'll just task everybody with this, which is we need a science, a developmental science that is as good on the individual front. We've made huge progress. As good on the context and setting front as it is so far at the individual level. And that's a real task for all of us.
Thank you. Anyone else? Do you want to comment? Okay.
So let's move on to the next question. My apologies, it's a bit lengthy. But the question is, what are your considerations about the specificities and psychometric features of lab tasks, online assessments, ecological measures, and parents or teacher reports or surveys in the measurement of self-regulation? So in other words, how do you think that different types of measurement of EF and self-regulation compare?
Please, one at a time.
Sabine, do you want to answer?
Let's go.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
maybe
Well, I wasn't unmuted yet, so I couldn't talk because my mic was muted. I just wanted to very quickly say that there's a lot of noise there's a garbage truck outside. My kid is screaming, so I'll be very brief, and I may not be able to jump in on all of the questions, and I made a very good decision to record my talk in advance. I'll just tell you that. I don't know if I fully understood the question, but how are these different measures related? Or like, how do we think that these different types of measurements are related? If that's the question, then I would say, I don't know if they're actually related. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to really start acknowledging more. Like, we don't need to make sense of all of this. We don't need to come up with the overarching model that's going to fit all of these things together in a neat way, because they were, as some of you mentioned earlier, these are from different theoretical traditions and for different purposes. And so it's, you know, every now and then there comes a paper that says, like, that tries to unify some of these different constructs like effortful control and executive function and other things. And, you know, it's very common to think of executive function components as underlying self-control, as I said. And I think that we can question that more, and I would push for questioning it more instead of trying to resolve and reconcile things. Otherwise, if someone has a very specific goal in terms of what they're trying to do, like you want to intervene to improve children's outcomes in a very particular setting, well then start there and think, what kind of measures do you need in order to assess self-regulation or executive function in that setting? Or, you know, what would you like to use in order to train executive function in that setting, instead of trying to make sense of everything and start from there? Because I'm kind of skeptical, even though like some of the presentations today were compelling, I still think I'm skeptical that we can kind of take the literature at face value and try to make sense of it all. Because I think for too long, people have just been citing Miyake and colleagues and just saying, yeah, those are the three components. And like, if you just accept that as somebody who just came into the field, then you're going to be kind of limiting yourself in how you think about it.
So can I just, since I'll let Julia go and then I'll respond.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
So I tend to agree with you, Sabine. I both agree and I disagree. I agree, and we've spent a lot of time in our group trying to parse the frameworks and the language of the broad social emotional learning field. Mm-hmm. We developed a website that is about like allowing all the frameworks and terminology and research to exist, but trying to understand how the parts are connected to each other. I think the big challenge, especially when we transition to designing things for practice, is that we look to evidence to guide us. We look to science to help us figure out what we should focus on. And if I'm saying self-control is A, and someone else is saying self-control is B, and I'm trying to design something for a teacher and then communicate to a future researcher about what to measure, and we design something for self-control B, but because all the measures are also called measures of self-control, I might measure that thing with self-control measure A and decide, oh, it doesn't work. When in fact, because of the terminological confusion, I have misfired, and they're in a lot of ways. And so I agree that getting to like one model is really complicated. But if we could communicate to the field that if you're gonna think about practice, you have to be really precise about what it is you're targeting. You have to define it in behavior. And then you have to make sure that whatever measure you're using is about that thing, whatever you call it. And maybe that's what we can call on all of us to do, which is to do those things. Sort of put the words aside for a moment and then describe the phenomenology of it and make sure that we are doing that in the measures and in the conceptualization and in the practice.
I mean, I think I totally agree with what you just said. My point was not that we should just abandon trying to understand it or coming up with a coherent conceptualization. It's more that we don't need to say how, like, the tasks and the questionnaires, like these were, you know, developed in different traditions. And so we don't need to say like that they are related in a very specific way, because often they aren't.
Yeah, I agree.
Julia?
Actually, I agree on what both of you said, but I think the question tackles a really important problem that we face all in our research, because it's actually what happens in our data quite often is that tasks do not show the relationships that we would conceptually expect them to show. I mean, I'm not surprised that, for instance, lab-based assessment of kids doesn't correlate with parent-based assessment in a questionnaire. That I can easily understand why, but if I do have 2 tasks or 3 tasks that are supposed to tap the same construct, say working memory, then it comes in handy, especially if you try to model the data, if they do so, show some form of correlation. And in our experience, that works pretty well with working memory tasks. But if you look at inhibition, it's a whole different story. Admittedly, the whole construct of inhibition is much more heterogeneous, probably, than working memory capacity. So it's to be expected that tasks that measure response inhibition probably do not correlate as highly with tasks measuring interference control as you would expect them to. But even if you have like 2 different versions of the same paradigm, let's say a flanker inhibition task with letters and one with shapes, you would expect them to correlate relatively highly, which they often don't. So this type of measurement impurity or reliability issue that we have is especially statistically a challenge if you have large data sets. And I try to make the point that especially for if you think in terms of interventions, you have to be sure what you're actually targeting in order to get to specific changes in the long run. So I don't think I have a final answer to that question, but I'm totally on board with the problem that we are facing here.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Sole.
Well, another question. To what extent are self-regulation and executive function culturally defined in terms of universal and specific skills? Should I repeat it? Yes.
Go ahead.
To what extent are self-regulation and executive function culturally defined in terms of universal and specific skills?
Huge problem.
It's another great question. These are all like the questions at the heart of it all. So Great job, everyone, coming up with those great. I'm not an expert in the literature on self-regulation and executive function across the world, and my hunch is that there's less of it in places outside of the U.S. and maybe Canada than we would like in order to really address that question. But my hunch is, when we think about core developmental phenomena, is that it is highly unlikely that there isn't some sort of universal human developmental mechanism construct that represents this stuff, that is human, that is about developing humans and humanness, but that how it tests and how it is supported and how it is displayed and the sort of conditions that enable it varies probably quite a bit across the world. So as with everything, there's a blend of universal and non-universal elements.
Yes, Sabine, please, you are mute.
Sorry.
You are still mute.
I'm mute.
Thank
Okay,
you, Sabine.
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I mean, I would suggest that it is really, I mean, we don't necessarily have to be, to know about all the literature. I think there is a good amount of literature looking at executive function cross-culturally, and I think it is emerging as a more popular topic. But I do think it's heavily culturally defined, and that I think is another frontier or something that we need to grapple with more. Particularly, you know, my expertise is with these laboratory measures in preschool age kids, and for too long we just kind of didn't really question like the nature of these measures, how we inherited them, and I'm kind of concerned that it sets it up so that certain people just look like they have good executive function because it's measured in a very culturally relevant way. You know, sitting in a laboratory with an experimenter, following their instructions, you know, completing tasks that are about arbitrary things like shapes and colors and things that might make more sense to certain people in certain cultural groups, even within our country, you know, or across countries. So I do think that it is culturally defined, and I think we need to think about that more. And I know there are some people who are actively pursuing this.
Okay, Nick and Sole, if you agree, I can ask the last question for all of the speakers because we are almost done. Okay, this is for each one of you, okay? So I expect, we expect comments of each one of you. What do you think studies in this field will be like 10 or 20 years from now? Expectation is not the same as a dream. It's not about dreaming. It's about the more real stuff. What do you expect from the next 1 or 2 decades?
Can I speak?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Nancy.
I'm hoping that we are going to get a lot more convergence on different models. And I'm hoping we get to a point where we agree at least on some things. I think, you know, a model is like, I do think a model isn't reality. It's something that we have and we use if it's useful. If it's not useful, then, you know, why use it, right? So I'm hoping when we get to, I really like what some people said about using different models for different things, because I think that that's a way to go. Because I think that we need to use models that are useful for different contexts and different places and different fields. So I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit of convergence, but also that we will tolerate and, you know, accept other views.
Thank you, Nancy. Who else?
I'll just really quickly,
Okay, go ahead, Sabine.
You could probably hear the garbage truck right around the corner. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think if I was to make a prediction based on the talks today, I'd say there'd maybe be more focus on context and social influences, possibly in interventions, and maybe moving away from the strict kind of 3 components view.
Thank you. Julia?
Well, I'm hoping that we will be successful in creating a lot more large-scale and longitudinal data sets, because I think that's what we really need to tackle some of the core questions that we have discussed today. And I also think that maybe there will be some changes in the way we collect data. I mean, we see now, because of the whole COVID situation, that lots of things are being implemented online or on mobile testing devices. So I think maybe we will move a bit away from our standard lab experiments, which in terms of context can be a good thing. And I'm hoping that will change a bit the way that we design our studies and also open new possibilities.
So I would say something similar to that, which is that I go back to Bronfenbrenner's exhortation to all of us, or to developmental science at large, to be valid and vital. Valid meaning the work is conducted in the real world, and vital meaning it responds to the demands and the questions and the concerns of the world. So I would hope that our science can be more fully field embedded, and that we can come up with mechanisms to enact the science in ways that are internally and externally valid and rigorous but relevant. So I hope we can, I think we're headed in that direction. I just hope we can, I hope funders and communities and researchers can come together in a different type of partnership to make that happen in a different way than it has in the past.
Thank you. Sole?
So, unfortunately, well, we've arrived to the end of the webinar. We hope you all have found this meeting to be as interesting and motivating as we have. We thank Nancy, Julia, Rebecca, Stephanie, and Sabine for sharing your knowledge and your considerations on this topic. We thank all of you for your effort, your disposition, and your kindness. We remind all of you that the webinar will be available in a few days on the YouTube channel we share in the program. So thanks again, enjoy the rest of the day, and take care.
Take care, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing. It was really great.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
You're
very
welcome.
much.
Bye.